Good morning and welcome to the Morning Scoop for Monday, May 9th. This is your daily Buckeye Fix. I'm Tom Orr. The Notre Dame game is in 118 days, the game against Michigan in 202 days. This morning, we're going to continue our run through the post-spring two-deep, and we're on to the defenses today. My guest once again is Tony Gerdeman. We host the Buckeye Weekly podcast together, and on that one, he always asks me how it's going. So, Tony, how's it going?
Tom, it's going pretty good. I saw this week that we are closer to the first college football game of the year than we are to the last college football game of last year. So that made me smile.
Is that true? Yeah, I guess that is true. Yeah, all right.
I saw
there
it
you go.
on
That's
the
good
internet.
news. It must be true. Abraham Lincoln said so it must be true. It's on the internet. Yeah, there's a graphic with a picture of Abe Lincoln, obviously. So this morning, we're going to start with a topic that Abe Lincoln does not know a lot about, the Ohio State defense. We're going to start with the defensive ends. This is a spot where it feels like you might see a bunch of starters at some point during the course of the season. So instead of like a true two deep, let's just kind of look at this as maybe like a top four or so. Who do you think is in that top group that, might be someone who gets a start at some point this year?
Yeah, and I'm going to have to side on the or so of that top four because we know just go ahead and put Zach Harrison in there. I think you can go ahead and put JT Tuimoloau in there. And I don't think you can leave out Javonte Jean-Baptiste. He's a fifth-year guy. I'm not so sure you can leave out Tyler Friday, another fifth-year guy who is coming back from injury, missed last year, came back. And those two guys, Tyler Friday and Javonte Jean-Baptiste, have been involved when they've been healthy. They've been part of that top five. So, Tom, I don't think you can leave out Jack Sawyer. So I think that's five there. And then that kind of leaves out a guy named Caden Curry, who is, just a true freshman. But I think that top five is that top five, and I would consider them all guys. I won't be surprised if any one of those guys starts any particular week.
Yeah, and, Jim Knowles has talked in the past about not really caring about who starts, and it's just kind of matchups, and sometimes they're playing Rutgers, and Rutgers is not very good at football, and so you start the two New Jersey guys, and Tyler Friday and Javonte Jean-Baptiste start that week. Whether they would start the week before or the week after, start them against Rutgers because it's their home state school. We saw them do that a couple of years ago at Rutgers. Rutgers is a home game this year, so yeah, I think I'm right with you. I think that's probably the top group of those those five guys, and there are questions about whether Tyler Friday is going to be completely healthy and all that, but if everyone's healthy, that seems like a perfectly reasonable top group. Behind those guys, there's been a ton of shuffling on the back end of that depth chart. Darian Henry-Young, Cormonte Hamilton, Jacoby Cowan, Noah Potter. All four of those guys have entered the portal since the end of last season. It doesn't feel, though, like they're necessarily shorthanded here. Normally, you would hear four guys leave, and it's like, oh, man, danger, desperate depth situation. It doesn't really feel like that's the case at the defensive end spot. So, who else do you think is in the mix at that defensive end room other than the five guys we just talked about?
Yeah, and we'll have to see what happens with Mitchell Melton and his injury and whether or not 2022 is even in the cards for him. But he would have been another guy that would have been tough to keep off the field based on what we heard in the spring. But behind them, I think it's really you're just looking at true freshmen at this point with Caden Curry, who is already on campus. You've got Amari Abor coming in this summer, and you've got Kenyatta Jackson coming in this summer. And I think, and then Tom, help me out if I'm missing anybody, but that's about it. And when you think about, you've just lost four guys, you lost them because there were five guys ahead of them and maybe another one on equal footing and more coming. And this is just one of these things that it just replenishes himself. And I don't think I'm missing anybody. I ran through the roster beforehand, and there's not a lot of guys in terms of outside of that top five who have really any experience.
Yeah, I mean, beyond those guys in terms of true defensive ends, I think you're pretty much right. There's probably some question about do they get in that Jack Leo spot and, you maybe get a kind of, someone who's listed as a linebacker who maybe slides in there. Does
Paula E, he got a little bit of work in the spring there at that Jack position.
Yeah, the Paula E and Aoteote. He's probably the most likely of anyone in that linebacker room to potentially move down. I mean, Mitchell Melton was the other guy who was in that linebacker room who they were trying there, and then he had that knee injury during the spring game, and We have not heard an official word, but generally those non-contact injuries like that are, not great for your prognosis for playing that fall, but that's a little bit TBD. But yeah, there is not really all of the veteran depth there is all in the portal, or, actually really at this point, most of them are in their new homes. Darian Henry-Young is at Kentucky, Cormonte Hamilton is at Memphis, and Jacoby Cowan is at UNC. So we're still waiting on Noah Potter as of right now, but yeah, I mean, there are, the veteran depth is all gone, which is that's kind of how it goes right now with the transfer portal era. The interior defensive line spots are a little bit similar to the ends, where there's a couple very exciting second-year guys, where, you mentioned JT Tuimoloau and Jack Sawyer. They have the versions of those guys inside. And then there's a group of older veterans who've shown they can be solid players as well, and, maybe have a contract year coming up. Let's start at the 3-tech defensive tackles, or defensive spot. How do you think the depth chart looks at 3-tech right now?
I think it could be better. I think the top two, with Taron Vincent and Tylek Williams, is good. I think this needs to be Taron Vincent's best year. Obviously, I think it will be Tylek Williams' best year. He's in better shape. He's more well-equipped to be on the field more. Behind them, Jaden McKenzie had a good spring game, and I've kind of compared him a little bit to Jerron Cage, different positions, Jerron Cage at nose tackle, but one of these guys who really does not see the field much his first 4 years, but then can eventually become something of a contributor and maybe even a starter, and has been the, has he been the beneficiary of maybe not tremendous recruiting at that nose tackle position, in terms of Jerron Cage, whereas that's not necessarily the case at 3-tech, where they are able to bring guys in, and you can also move defensive ends down at times. So I'm thinking, I like the top two really well. I still need to see something from Jaden McKenzie where he's not just, he looked good in the spring game, but you got to be more than that. And then behind them, I think maybe this is where Hero Kanu starts out, and we really don't know in terms of what one guy is. One year he may become something else the next year in terms of this back and forth. We've seen cross training, but I think it's going to be difficult for Jaden McKenzie to hold off Hero Kanu if Hero Kanu does move there. But again, we've talked about this on Buckeye Weekly, where Hero Kanu is really new to the game, so there may be a steep learning curve for him.
Yeah, he. If you're not familiar with his story, he is from Germany. Came over with a group that basically identifies football talent in Europe and brings them over to the U.S. to play in high schools here and potentially line themselves up for college scholarships. So he's only been playing football for a couple of years. So the size is there, the quickness is there. There's going to be some time probably that takes to refine him, and he was not in for the spring. That's another thing that maybe sets him back a little bit. And, I would assume coming from Germany in the middle of your high school career probably makes it so you're not able to get way ahead of the game in terms of credits. So it makes sense that maybe he wasn't ready to enroll early in the spring, but that potentially sets him back a little bit. But it does feel like, that's another spot where Tylek Williams, that second year player. I mean, I think if you ask people who are they most excited about in terms of defensive ends, they're going to say JT Tuimoloau and Jack Sawyer. It feels like at 3-tech. Taron Vincent was a 5-star player coming out of high school and has just been constantly banged up, and it feels like we haven't really seen the best of him yet. If he can stay healthy, that's a huge piece of the puzzle for this Ohio State team. But Tylek Williams, I think everyone saw just enough last year that of the 4 second-year defensive linemen, and we'll get to Mike Hall in a minute, but of the 4 second-year defensive linemen, it feels like Tylek Williams might be the person who just the average Ohio State fan might be more excited about than any of those other second-year guys, with the possible exception of JT Tuimoloau.
Well, and if you look at the comparative snaps and the results from those snaps, I don't think anybody on that defensive line touches what Tylek Williams was able to do in his limited snaps, finishing second or third on the team in both sacks and tackles for loss, while playing hundreds of snaps fewer than Haskell Garrett and Zach Harrison, and fewer snaps. And I'm going to assume JT Tuimoloau, I could pull him up. But there's what he was able to do in his limited reps, not being able to play more because he wasn't in good enough shape. I think it's it's dangerous to project. Like, oh, if he's playing, 3 times as many snaps this year, like Haskell Garrett was playing, or 2 times, that you just project, 14 tackles for loss and 10 sacks, like for a sophomore defensive tackle, that would be pretty incredible. And there's no necessarily Akron on the schedule where he's going to get 2 or 3 sacks, maybe, but there is, Toledo or something like that, where there are going to be some opportunities for him to make some numbers. But I also think the more important thing is doing it against Penn State, Michigan, Notre Dame. Like, we don't need any stat padding here. You need the consistency rather than he has 3 good games and looks like he's leading the Big Ten in something.
Yeah, I think he had 3 of his sacks, 2.5 or 3 of his sacks against Akron last year, which there is not, to your point, there is not an Akron on the schedule this year. Maybe Arkansas State's the closest, or Toledo, but there's a lot of daylight between Toledo and Akron in terms of talent right now. So yeah, he's someone who's going to be really interesting to see where he ends up. It feels like not only can he play like that against Penn State and Michigan and Notre Dame and all those other teams, can he do that for 5 plays in a row, 4 plays in a row, rather than playing for 2 plays and then having to come out for a breather. He talked this spring about being in much better shape. So potentially, yes, he's setting himself up for that. And then, we'll see where he is by the time this fall rolls around. Next door at that nose tackle spot, who's starting? I mean, is this Jaron Cage is kind of number 1? Who's starting there to you? And then who else is in the mix for kind of regular playing time?
Yeah, and I actually wrote about the defensive tackles last week, spring recap, and just based on what we saw in the spring game, it's Jaron Cage 1, Ty Hamilton 2, Mike Hall 3. And again, here's a situation where I won't be surprised at all to see Ty Hamilton starting at some point this year. Mike Hall would probably surprise me a little bit. Not that he can't play, but because he's got a third-year guy and a sixth-year guy ahead of him, which makes things a little bit more difficult. And Jaron Cage will do what the coaches want. He's solid. Ty Hamilton, I think, has more upside and is starting to show that. Mike Hall, I think, has more upside than maybe any of them. And this is a guy who's a really good athlete. Could certainly play 3-tech, but I think you want to separate him and Tylek Williams on the field so that you can play them together. And that's why I like the move at this point. And so I think they've got a solid 3. But again, it's only 3. And I don't believe there's anybody else, and there's nobody else coming unless they move Hero Canoe over there. That's a situation where they need to hit that in recruiting in 2023 again and start building up that interior, unless they're going to move a defensive end over or something like that. And really, I don't see that happening because I don't think they're going to move JT Tuimoloau, and he'd be the most likely. Yeah,
there really is not there's not anyone else on that roster who fits that interior defensive line spot. I mean, they had Noah Potter was kind of in that conversation where they had been playing him some at 3-tech. He's obviously gone now. So yeah, there's a lot of 3 is what having 3 guys who you feel reasonably good about is like good. That's really good depth. You'd like to have having one more of those guys who you brought in, a second defensive tackle who you brought in this 2022 class would probably make people feel a little better about where things are looking long term. That's going to be a very big position for the 2023 class that Larry Johnson is currently working on right now. But there's a lot to like there, though. I feel like you've got. I feel like Ty Hamilton. I mean, is there a more underrated player where I feel like when you and I, when we're talking about defensive line, I feel like we don't talk about Ty Hamilton enough. Where he's just. He came to Ohio State, he's the younger brother of Devon Hamilton, and he was a solid player. He was, didn't have the flashy 5-star recruiting ranking. He didn't make an immediate splash, but you just kind of when you watch practice, when you watch the spring game, he's just he's making plays. He's doing what he's supposed to be doing. He feels like someone who we're probably not talking about enough. And I feel like kind of Ohio State fans on the whole, if you ask them to run down the list of defensive linemen, Ty Hamilton might be like the 13th guy that people write down as just do a Sporkle quiz on Ohio State defensive linemen. Ty Hamilton's like the 12th or 13th guy, but in terms of production this year, he's probably a lot higher than that.
Yeah, and when I wrote about the defensive tackles last week, I think I asked, are we sure that Ty Hamilton isn't the best nose tackle on the team? And this is about when, and he's a third-year sophomore. This is about when Devon Hamilton started to take off, and when he really showed up and was really in the rotation. Because Robert Landers, as a redshirt freshman, I think at one point, I think he finished with like 7 tackles for loss, and at one point was leading the team, and he was the guy that had ascended first instead of Devon Hamilton. They were part of the same class, both late ads, lower ranked guys. But then, Devon Hamilton started to come up after that and really started to blossom, and then became a dominant player his 5th year for the Buckeyes, and gave Ohio State a few good seasons in that rotation. And if we're going to compare him to his brother, this is where things will start taking off. And he was a guy that came in undersized, and even as a true freshman was impressing people. They talked about his strength, and you knew he was a little bit quicker than most because he came in around, I don't know, like 260 pounds and had to grow up. But has also been a nose tackle, I think, for almost all of that time. So has been dealing with playing undersized, and now he's listed, I think, 6'3", 290, still strong, still quick. And yeah, Tom, I'm with you. It really wouldn't surprise me if he is the full-time starter by the end of camp, and is also a productive, in terms of statistics, guy.
Yeah, and Devon Hamilton, if you're just wondering what's Devon Hamilton up to right now, played in all 16 games last year for the Jaguars, 26 solo tackles, 1 sack, 40 tackles, 2 sacks in his NFL career, 27 games. I mean, that's someone who, based on his recruiting ranking, he shouldn't be anywhere near there, and yet there he is. Yeah, it feels like Ty Hamilton, it's such a lazy comp to compare one brother to another, but it feels like a lot of the stuff that worked out really well for Devon Hamilton, Ty Hamilton is kind of on track to be able to do some of that same stuff. So,
how often has it been wrong when you compare Ohio State brother defensive linemen, to their brothers? I mean, when in history has that ever not worked? It's always, in my recollection, it's always worked.
The Boses have worked out. Let's see. You started saying that, and I was going to say, well, there's Marcus and Malik Hooker, but that's not a defensive lineman. So yeah, the Boses. Who else? Which other brothers am I not immediately thinking of? Is it just the Boses?
I'm not. It's just the Boses and the Hamiltons at this point.
Yeah, batting 1,000 with a 1-for-1. So yes, well on their way to a perfect career. We talked a little bit about those 3 true freshmen we've talked about the 4 true freshmen. Caden Curry, who was in for the spring. We're going to kind of set him aside as a potential contributor for this fall because he was in for the spring, and that gives you such a leg up. Of the other 3 guys, Amari Abor, Kenyatta Jackson, Hero Kanu, who gets the most snaps this season?
Man.
And I will remind you, you are under oath.
Yes, I know. My immediate answer is Hero Kanu, but then I keep having to remind myself, like, he only sort of knows how to play football. And and then defensive tackles aren't going to play as much as defensive ends. I think we have to understand that as well. And Rushmen packages, you're going to have 4 defensive ends in there. So maybe we have to go to the defensive ends. And then you look at, I have no idea, Tom. I'm going to say, and I know I'm not going to be right, and I understand I'm under oath, and it feels like you shouldn't be held accountable for things you say that you don't know. And if you say you don't know, you should be found innocent of any charges. I think Kenyatta Jackson looks more like a college defensive end, but he also is going to put more weight on. So I don't know if he's strong enough. Omari Abor looks stronger. And does that mean he's more ready? Tom, I don't know that, because I'm already on record saying I think everybody redshirts, but they're still going to play. So who has more snaps? And it's probably going to come down to Kenyatta Jackson had 36 snaps and Omari Abor had 32. Ha 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 ha. So I'm going to go Kenyatta Jackson.
All right, there it is. A 100% ironclad, guaranteed money-back lock from Tony Gerdeman. Kenyatta Jackson, the most snaps of the 3 summer enrollees. So Tony, thank you for joining me. If you do happen to place a bet on that and lose money on it, you can find Tony on Twitter at Tony Gerdeman and yell at him there for losing you money. I mean, Tony, look at the size of that lock. I mean, come on. How could anyone question you? That's no question, no doubt. Kenyatta Jackson, take it to the bank. So that'll do it for today. Thank you guys all for joining us. Have a great day. We'll talk to you tomorrow.